Hi students, how are you doing? So this is a quick summary tutorial, and so I'll say hi. Um, when you approach the questions on Ignatium and in your text, there are a couple of general ideas that you want to um, have to kind of frame what you're doing. So this is um, an example of how to do that. So the general methods that we're talking about when you analyze these models is first you want to find the relevant equilibrium, and then you want to quantify the welfare effects. So the first part of this tutorial is about, or this lecture, supplemental lecture, is about finding the relevant equilibrium in a couple of different cases that we've already talked about. So here's something that should be familiar, and I've been really careful on this diagram to let you know that, and I'll point it out with the pointer tool, that the price is being measured in dollars per unit, right? So here the equilibrium price is $10 per unit um, for each unit of the good that's traded. And you can see the equilibrium quantity here is at 215. So this is the example of a competitive market equilibrium, and it's the one that we highlight most often. Um, the thing that I want to point out with the little circle here is I've circled the equilibrium point where demand and supply cross, and you can see it's associated with an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. So every point that you're going to find on these diagrams, you can associate with a price and a quantity, and that's what you want to do. Um, so let's go ahead and go to our observations about this. Okay, so what's special about the competitive equilibrium? Well, notice that at our equilibrium price, we have this special situation where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So in other words, we're saying at the price of $10, right, um, every buyer that wants to buy a unit can find a seller who wants to sell a unit at that price. And notice that at all other prices, there are no coincidence um, between the wants of buyers and sellers. And so this alignment of the desires of buyers and sellers is actually a property of a competitive market. And that's one that you're introduced to in your book at the beginning and that we've talked about in lecture so far. So again, in this example, at a price of $10, um, exactly the buyers want to purchase 215 units and the sellers want to sell 215 units. So again, I'll go back and let you take another look at the diagram. At any other price, that won't be true. And so that's what we mean by characterizing our equilibrium. And okay, so we'll move to another example. So this is an example of a market that has a price ceiling policy. And remember, we can have binding or non-binding price ceilings. This one is an example of a binding price ceiling at $5. Again, we have an equilibrium price at $10, and the price ceiling price is $5. It's below the existing market price. So it's actually going to force buyers and sellers to change their behavior. Um, Sellers that were selling at $10 are going to have to lower their price to $5. And so I've indicated these 2 points to draw your attention to what happens in this type of a situation. And here at a price of $5, you can see from the supply curve that the quantity supplied is only 100 units. But buyers, if you go over to the demand curve that's associated with the price of $5, at that point, you'll notice that the quantity demanded is 300. So we don't have a match. There is an equilibrium, um, but the equilibrium in this price ceiling, the binding price ceiling example, is characterized by a shortage. And so I've indicated that as the distance between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. Um, and I also want to call your attention that in your book, it's called a shortage, and it's also called excess demand. Um, and that's caused, again, by this binding price ceiling. So what do we have to say there? Well, in a competitive market, under a binding price ceiling policy, it produces a different type of equilibrium than an unregulated market. And in particular, it does not balance quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So you have this shortage. And so in the example that we've just shown you, buyers want to purchase 300 units, sellers only want to sell 100 units, and we can't force the sellers to sell more than they want to. Um, in this scenario, we assume if they only want to sell 100 units, that's all they're going to sell. And so that means there are going to be 200 buyers um, that can't find the good when the price is held at $5 instead of letting it go to the equilibrium price. So if this market wasn't regulated, so this is a price regulation or a price control policy, but in an unregulated market, the price is just free to float to whatever level comes about as buyers and sellers negotiate and haggle and buy and sell. And in an unregulated market, what would normally happen is the shortage would cause the price to rise toward the competitive equilibrium level of $10. And in doing so, it would reduce that shortage so that, and we didn't on this diagram indicate what the equilibrium quantity would be, but it looks like it would be something like about 200 units. So once we let the price go to 10, we would have 200 units that were offered for sale, and then there would be exactly 200 buyers, and the equilibrium would be restored, and there would no longer be a shortage. Now, one of the things that kind of confuses students a little bit, and I want to just be clear that we're not saying shortages are good or bad. We're not, and if you pay attention to the early part of your book, they talk about positive, which are descriptive statements, and normative statements, which are policy or value-laden statements. It's about what you should or you shouldn't do, what's good or bad. And this characterization of the equilibrium as resulting in a shortage when there's a binding price ceiling, we're not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just an observation. So the way, notice, that the shortage is reduced is as the price, if it was allowed to float up, if this price ceiling was removed, then as the price goes up, there are some buyers that would decide they didn't want to purchase the good. And as the price goes up, there would also be additional sellers that decide that at the higher price they want to sell the good. So the result is that at a price of $10, you have 200 units offered for sale and 200 units are being purchased. But that doesn't mean that because a shortage disappears, that suddenly the people that wanted to purchase 300 units at the price of 5, everybody can. So the market solves the problem by actually providing incentives so some buyers at the higher price no longer want the good. And at the higher price, sellers who were not willing to sell at a price of $5, now those sellers at the price of $10 have the incentive to go ahead and produce the good and sell it. So that is a quick summary of where we are with respect to that first step. Remember, we have 2 steps, and actually at this stage we're going to be moving to the second step. So this is a recap of things you've learned already. And our 2 steps are, find the relevant equilibrium and characterize it. And then the step 2 is to quantify the welfare effects. So we'll go ahead and we'll pick up on step 2 in our next video. Okay, see you soon.